The Treasury welcomed officials from each of the G7 nations and others to 11 Downing Street for a seminar on how to avoid another banking crisis, or at least prevent one where taxpayers end up footing the bill. I've been hearing from the seminar's host, the City Minister, Lord Myners.
I think we've made very good progress around the issues. Some of these are quite complicated. The devil, as always, is in the detail. And the two things which we were talking about today were systemic risk levies and something called contingent capital, which is when subordinated debt of banks automatically turns into shareholder equity if the bank suffers significant losses.
And is there going to be the sort of global agreement that everyone talks about? Because everyone expresses their anger at what happened, but then when action is required, we're told, well, we can't act alone.
I think there does need to be global coordination around agreed principles. There are some things like transaction taxes which simply wouldn't work unless they were implemented across the board. They are intellectually appealing, but from a practical purpose need global implementation. There are other issues which can be done locally, as we've done in this country already to strengthen our banks, and as President Obama is considering doing in the States at the moment.
Is your negotiating hand with the big banks considerably weaker than it was when, at that time, they were being bailed out?
No, I think it's always important for us to remind ourselves of the need to press on and secure fundamental improvement. We've gone from patching up the system and making sure that the banks don't fail or place at risk global economic activity. Now we've got to say, what lessons have we learned and how can we ensure that the mistakes of the past are never repeated?
But why should they listen to you when they're making money again?
They are still very dependent upon the world's central banks and governments for their operating franchises. Governments shouldn't be treated in a dismissive way by banks. Governments, after all, set the rules of the game.
But what can you do if they do treat you dismissively?
We take actions around their capital requirements, for instance. If we see banks doing things which we regard as a source of instability or unmanaged risk, we already have the powers to require them to put much more capital behind those activities, and if that's not sufficient, to actually, through something called variation of permissions, to actually deny them the authority to engage in certain activities. What we need to do is to ensure that they're coordinated internationally and we don't have some form of arbitrage in which banks gravitate to those jurisdictions which they believe to have the lightest regulation.
In an article in The Guardian today, you described the rescue of the banks as fundamentally unfair. What did you mean?
I said it appeared to many people to be unfair.
Do you think it was fundamentally unfair? You wrote it is the fundamental unfairness of the rescue that should be the cause of lasting anger.
Yes, and I think that, but anger in itself is not the answer. It's the response to that, and it's to say that we can't allow this to happen again.
Well, I was asking you about the rescue itself. Do you think it was fundamentally unfair?
No, I think the rescue was necessary in order to support economic activity, and indeed the action we took here has been evidently successful in that the recession has been much less damaging in terms of job losses and house repossessions and business failures than it otherwise would have been. So supporting the banking system was right, but bailing out the bankers and the bank shareholders is seen by many people to be unfair, that large bonuses are being paid at a time when people are still struggling to cope with a difficult economy. That's the type of issue that we now need to address.
Goldman Sachs London staff are having their pay and bonus capped at $1 million.
Most senior directors are. I'm not sure it's correct to say that no one in Goldman Sachs London is being paid more than £1 million this year. And indeed, I think I'm pretty confident that there will be people who are paid more than £1 million a year. Now, I personally find that level of reward pretty unpalatable.
Except, Goldman Sachs are acting in this way because of the tax regime and the new regulations imposed by the Treasury. I wonder what you think of the figure.
I personally regard those numbers as being extraordinarily high. I think it's salutary for banks and bankers to ask them what they think national average earnings are, what they think the national average minimum wage is, and then to set their own rewards and their own approach to reward in that context. I do that week after week after week, challenging the banks about their values and their culture and their approach to reward. And with many of them, it's having an influence. With others, it's pushing a stone uphill.
You said yesterday you want a major independent review into how investment banking has permeated so many corners of society. Why don't you just start one?
I think to start a review so close to a general election would not be a sensible thing to do. This is work for our next government, and it will be certainly an item which I will be pushing hard on the agenda when we hopefully return to office after the upcoming general election.
It can't be done before May the 6th?
No, I think something of the sort that I have in mind, which is to ask questions about have we put market liquidity and dealing too much in the ascendancy, and in so doing we've forsaken long-term investment and sustainable investment. Have we permitted a regime which is too permissive for the takeovers of companies? This is quite serious work. It would need to be led by an academic economist. It would probably take a year or so. It's much better to launch it after a general election.
Lord Myners.